So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the second tabernacle services, where we find then the scripture used is the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation is from the original manuscripts of the prophets of Yahweh, then indicating for us the understanding of the time of the end. And then reading from Yeshayahu, the 61st chapter, we find then the time of the end, roughly from the 61st chapter until the 66th. You find a lot of information regarding the time of the end and its layerings then with Galah and then also with the spring feast. So then these days where there are so many denominations and a lot of them, they are not in line with the Torah. In fact, they shun the Torah, they mock at the Torah, and they don't understand the Torah is what they are reading. They don't want to admit, but when they read the spring feast known as the Gospels, what they are reading is then the completion of the spring feast. So then, when we begin our understanding then regarding Torah, we find then Yochanan, the first time in the holy city, and Yochanan had a great deal of experiencing walking with the Messiah. Obviously he was there when the Messiah then started his ministry. He was there on Mount Gerizim when he transfigured himself. He was in the first holy city of his time. And then many people these days, they don't understand the writings of Hebrews. Who wrote Hebrews? It's very important understanding the area of Hebrews, because it was then a compilation of Megillahs until Yochanan. So you can safely say Shaul the Shaliach had part in it, but the person that actually had then recorded Hebrews or wrote truly Hebrews, then we can easily understand it was Yochanan. The reason why, it's because when you begin to read Yochanan, then the completion of the spring feast, you find then the literary understanding of Yochanan, then the first, second, and third Yochanans, you begin to understand then where he's coming from. Plus, then when you read Hebrews, then when he was in a holy city, the first holy city of the second tabernacle services, then he was gathering those Megillahs from many of them from Shaul, and he began to analyze what kind of work should be done in the tabernacles. Then you find the 7 cities in sin: Smyrna, Ephesus, Philadelphia, and then the other cities. You find then those cities were in sin. Obviously they did not know what to do over there, because there were areas of sin and they couldn't get rid of it. So then Yochanan, far away from those cities, he was in his own holy city for 36 months. That's why then you find the discrepancy of 2009 and then 2012. There was a fiasco. A lot of people got themselves in caves and silos, and they shut themselves up, only to discover the next day they had to come out of it and then return to their original lives. So then we find then during the time of Yochanan this manuscript of Hebrews. Those are the actions taken in the Holy of Holies, or then in the tabernacles. So it's very easily a person understanding where the Yochanan is coming from when he was in the first holy city, compiling the understanding of the entire Megillahs known at the time, and then writing down or then recording the actions of the Levites. When you read Hebrew, you are not truly reading Hebrews. You are reading the Levites or the Levites, or the work of the Levites. Because when you speak of Hebrew, you have to use the word set apart. That's the most popular understanding of then those selected or then from the lineage of the Hebrews. It makes no sense to write Hebrews. You are writing then Levitical work of the second tabernacle services. This is what those are for. So the writings then, you can easily say, is a compilation of what then was done up to the point. I mean, obviously Yochanan went through very thoroughly those Megillas, and via Ruach HaKodesh he was able to understand precisely what the Messiah wanted for his holy services. That's why you have Hebrews. So you can safely say Shaul then had part in it. Obviously he had, because he had understandings while Yochanan was evaluating those other Megillas. Came the understanding from also Shaliach Shaul and what he was doing. Because of the miracles, because of the functions, then thus you understand the work of Elohim in the Holy of Holies, or then obviously the tabernacles. So then there is a step of formation where you begin to understand what those mean. So if you want to truly understand then the scripture or the Torah regarding then spring feast, after then the spring feast records of Yochanan the spring feast, obviously the other area most importantly would be then afterwards Hebrews, or the works of the Levites. Or you can do Yochanan then Metityahu as a Levite filtering through, and then the acts of Ruach HaKodesh, and then you find then Shaliach Shaul going into the Gentile world, completing the first tabernacle service in the lives of the Hebrews, or the set apart, closing the first tabernacle service. And then prior of Revelation or Galah, then you read Hebrews. In fact, the proper understanding is having the first, second, and third chapters of Revelation first, then you read Hebrews next. And if you want to refine even further, then the first chapter related with the tabernacle would be then the 7th chapter of Revelation, where you find in the 144,000. That's the time prior of the 7th, and the 7th then pairs up with the 11th. Then before the 7th, then you read Hebrews. Because then what you have then the 7 cities of Asia Minor, those cities in sin. Then the Messiah had separated Yochanan in the first holy city. He evaluated the entire Megillas of the transitional time, and then obviously Ruach HaKodesh helped Yochanan come up with the holy services in the tabernacles. So then you read obviously the spring feast. So then you read the first section of Yochanan. Yohanan's spring feast is the utmost important. Then afterwards you read Metityahu. Why do you read Metityahu? Because Metityahu was a Levite. Yochanan first, because he was every important event in the life of the Messiah, Yochanan was with him. During the selection of the Shilishim, he was with him. During the time of the spring feast, he was with him. Then the Mount of Transfiguration, the Mount Gerizim, he was with him. He saw Moshe, Eliyahu. He was with him. He came down. Then he went to Jerusalem, and he was placed on the stake. The Messiah was placed on the stake. Yochanan was there. Then he came from the dead. Yochanan was there. In fact, when he came from the dead, then it was said, "Behold the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world." Because then he died, he became then the title of the Redemptor. Then he rose from the dead, then he was pointed and given the title, "Behold the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world." So there are the steps of formation. Then we begin to understand Galah. Then afterwards, then you read Metchiahu, because he's a Levite. Has to line up with it. And then there are some other details over there in Luke and Mark, but those are not very relevant. Then you read Acts of Ruach HaKodesh, where then you find Shaliach Shaul going into the Gentile world, visiting his people, the Hebraic people, enclosing the first tabernacle service in them, and preparing them for the second. Then you find the work of Shaliach Shaul in many of the places. And then, lastly, then you begin to understand what went on with those 7 cities, and then they were in sin. So then the Messiah had then set aside Yochanan. He was in the first holy city 36 months, and he had gathered the entire Megillas of the period of the transitional time. He evaluated with the help from Ruach HaKodesh. He came up with Hebrews, the work of the Levites of the second tabernacle services. Thus then you understand. So then truly, prior of reading the 7th chapter of Galah paired up with the 11th, then it would be Hebrews, then it would be the 4th chapter of Galah, and then the 11th chapter of Galah. Thus you have a complete understanding of the tabernacle. Then later you prepare yourself for the sounding of the shofars. So then we are every time, every day, learning more, understanding more the work of the Shilishim. And then being very cautious, because we have to have other writings, other Megillas from the prophets, for instance Yirmiyahu, or then the prophet Daniel, the extra writings of the prophet Daniel, very important. Then there are some areas where then even Daniel himself had many references of other prophets, or then Yirmiyahu in Maccabeus, where then you find Yirmiyahu being divinely warned of how to use the elevator system in a tabernacle, or then in the temple during the time of invasion of the Babylonian king, where then the elevator was activated, and then the holy ark and the holy objects were then saved and they never found. Then you find this record in Maccabeus. There is the record. It was divinely given for us. For some reason, maybe those people, when they evaluated the scripture, they were drunk and they decided to get rid of those, but because of their own stupidity, they don't understand the meaning of those holy documents. So those should be included in the scripture, because when there is a divine understanding of it, it's not your task of deciding what should be in a holy scripture and what not. You are reading separate Megillas, and whatsoever Megillah is related with the Spirit is included in a pile. As we understand, we are not reading from a codex. What was then Shaliach Shaul said? Renew the mind with understanding of the Torah. The Torah is not sewn together. The Torah is separated Megillas of spiritual understanding of times and seasons. That's why then when the Messiah was in the temple, he was given then the Megillah specific of Yeshayahu, 61st chapter. We understand the 61st chapter. During the time of the Messiah, he did understand as spring feast, completion of the spring feast. The Megillah of the completion of the spring feast via the prophet. There was no codex. Codex is stupidity. Makes no sense, because then you have a very complicated time understanding in layers. When you have a Megillah of a understanding, then this Megillah is paired up with another Megillah, then in your visual understanding, humans are very visual, then you begin to layer. When you have in codex, you can't layer because it gives you the idea of a single understanding rather than separated layers. That's why it's important when you read the scripture, understand you are reading a Megillah. Megillah of the prophet Yeshayahu related with the spring feast. Then you have many other Megillahs. Then when you understand those distinct Megillahs, then your mind functions as layering. When you read it from a Megillah, from a codex, it is always confusing because your mind does not separate, tend to link, because the mind is lazy. That's why Shaliach Shaul said, renew the mind with the Torah. Torah is layered. So then, we already understand how to read Hebrews. So the scripture is becoming a whole lot simpler than we ever thought, because the codex is separated. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.